Welcome. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because a lot of work went into uncovering the real events behind this chilling tale. This is a story from 1838 about a plantation master whose obsession with one of his slaves went far beyond anything anyone could imagine. A secret that turned the plantation into a place of fear, mystery, and dark rituals. The enslaved individual who arrived at the plantation in 1838 was unlike anyone the household had ever seen. From the very moment he stepped off the wagon, there was something about him that drew attention, a quiet intensity, a presence that seemed far older than his years, as though he carried the weight of experiences no one could imagine. The master, a man accustomed to control and authority, noticed him immediately. There was an almost magnetic pull, a fascination that went beyond mere curiosity. The other slaves whispered among themselves, sensing that something extraordinary, and perhaps dangerous, was stirring the air around the newcomer. He was assigned to the main house, serving directly under the master, and from the start, it was clear that he moved with a grace and confidence that set him apart from everyone else. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a weight that silenced rooms and demanded attention. The master, at first intrigued by his intelligence and composure, began to watch him constantly, noting how he handled the household tasks with precision and an almost uncanny understanding of human nature. Other members of the household began to feel an undercurrent of unease, noticing subtle changes in the master's demeanor whenever the young man was near. The slaves quickly learned that this individual possessed knowledge and skills that went beyond what was typical. He could read patterns in the weather and predict the success of the crops. He had a way of calming the animals that even the most experienced hands could not replicate. More strikingly, there were whispers of strange happenings when he was alone in the house at night, objects that seemed to move on their own. The faint scent of incense when no one had lit anything, and fleeting shadows that disappeared when anyone tried to investigate. None of these events were overtly threatening, but the weight of their strangeness left an impression on everyone who noticed them. The master's fascination grew steadily. What began as admiration for skill and intelligence slowly morphed into an obsession. He would watch the enslaved man for hours, studying his movements, trying to understand the way he carried himself, the rhythm of his work, the way he interacted with others. It wasn't just curiosity, it became a compulsion. Meals were prepared specifically to please him. Conversations were orchestrated to draw him out, and the master's entire day began to revolve around the presence of this single individual. Meanwhile, the enslaved man, aware of the master's scrutiny, maintained an almost impenetrable calm. He did not show fear, nor did he show flattery. But there was a quiet power in the way he moved through the house and the fields. The other slaves began to recognize that he wielded influence over the master without needing to speak directly. A nod, a gesture, or even a prolonged silence from him seemed to alter the master's behavior entirely, leaving him uncharacteristically deferential in ways that unsettled everyone around him. It wasn't long before the household and the surrounding community began to notice the master's obsession. Neighbors remarked on his changed demeanor, the way he spoke differently, walked differently, and spent inordinate amounts of time observing the young man from a distance. Rumors began to swirl that something unnatural was occurring inside the plantation walls. People speculated about the relationship between the master and his new enslaved servant, unable to explain why a man of such status would become so fixated on a single individual. The presence of the enslaved man had shifted the balance of the plantation entirely. He was no longer just a worker, but the center of attention, the object of an obsession that would grow into a dark and mysterious secret. The arrival of this enslaved individual set the stage for events that would shake the plantation to its core. His intelligence, his calm authority, and the inexplicable aura that surrounded him drew not only admiration but fear. The master, entranced and increasingly unbalanced, began to act in ways that were both irrational and dangerous, signaling the beginning of a story that would be remembered for generations, a story of power, obsession, and the terrifying allure of something that could not be understood, yet demanded total attention. In short, this man's arrival was more than just the addition of another worker to the plantation. It was the spark that ignited a chain of events that would blur the lines between control and submission, reality and superstition, fascination and worship. From the first day he stepped onto the grounds, the plantation was changed forever, and everyone who witnessed him knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The master's fascination with the enslaved man quickly grew beyond what anyone around him could have anticipated. At first, it seemed like mere admiration, an appreciation for the man's intelligence, poise, and almost otherworldly skill in handling the household and overseeing the plantation. But soon, it became something deeper, darker, and entirely consuming. The master began to devote hours of his day simply observing him, following him from room to room, noting the smallest gestures and movements, the way he spoke to others, the way he carried himself while performing his work. There was a subtle power in the enslaved man's presence, and the master found himself drawn to it in a way he could neither control nor understand. It started with small acts of obsession. The master began to insist on having the man eat at the main table, separate from the other enslaved individuals, so that he could observe him more closely. He would sit silently, studying every expression, every blink, every mannerism, as though trying to memorize him entirely. Sometimes he would call him to his office and ask questions about trivial matters, but these questions seemed designed less for practical answers than to prolong the time he could spend in the man's presence. The other household members whispered among themselves, uneasy about the attention being lavished on one individual in a way that had no precedent. As the fascination intensified, the master began to display behaviors that were outwardly irrational. He would stay awake late into the night, waiting to see the man return from the fields. He left meals untouched while he watched him, and often wandered the halls muttering to himself about the man's abilities, his calm demeanor, and the seeming power that radiated from him. Friends and family began to notice the change, remarking that the master no longer acted like the same man they had known. His decisions on the plantation grew erratic. He would prioritize tasks based solely on the enslaved man's involvement or proximity. If the man was present, the master would insist on overseeing every detail. If he was absent, the master would grow anxious, pacing and speaking to no one in particular. The obsession also extended to conversation and interaction. The master began asking questions that seemed deeply personal, probing the enslaved man about his past, his thoughts, and even his dreams. Yet, when the man answered, it was with calm, measured words that never revealed much, yet somehow drew the master even closer. The power dynamic of master and enslaved seemed to invert subtly. The master, who once commanded unquestioned authority, now seemed almost submissive in his fascination, eager to please, desperate for attention. The household began to feel the strain of this obsession. The other enslaved people watched in fear and confusion as their master's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. They whispered that he no longer treated them with the authority he once wielded, but instead spent inordinate amounts of time trying to impress or appease the man he had placed under his command. Even the house staff, who had once known the rhythms of the plantation well, grew nervous. Tasks were delayed, instructions changed without reason, and tension grew in the air as everyone sensed the growing imbalance of power. It wasn't long before neighbors and other plantation owners began to notice the change. The master, once proud and composed, now wandered the property obsessively, spending more time near the enslaved man than attending to the work he had been responsible for. Some whispered that he was under some kind of spell or influence, unable to act without the man's presence. Others speculated that he had begun worshipping the man in secret, performing odd gestures and rituals when alone, or leaving gifts in his quarters for reasons no one could comprehend. Rumors grew faster than the truth could be checked, spreading fear and unease throughout the surrounding area. By the middle of that year, the master's fixation had become unmistakable. He no longer merely observed. He attempted to imitate the man's behavior, copying his posture, speech patterns, and mannerisms. He would praise him in front of others, not out of kindness, but as a way of publicly affirming his admiration and dependence. Friends and family who tried to intervene found themselves met with anger or dismissiveness. The master had grown protective, almost defensive of his obsession. It was no longer a simple fascination. It had become a form of worship, with the enslaved man at the center of the plantation's hierarchy in ways that no one could openly explain. Even the enslaved man, calm and measured, seemed to recognize the shift. He did not encourage the attention, nor did he openly resist it. Yet his presence alone seemed to command the master's devotion. Tasks that once required strict orders now followed almost instinctively. As the master sought approval for every decision, his authority tangled with the intensity of his obsession. The air of the plantation became heavy, tense, and unpredictable, as if everyone living there was walking on fragile ground, aware that a single misstep could unleash the master's growing mania. Ultimately, the master's obsession was the catalyst for the darkest chapter of the plantation's history. What began as fascination for skill and presence became a consuming, irrational worship that affected not just his own actions, but the lives of everyone around him. The enslaved man, whether intentionally or not, had become the center of a power that even the master could not fully understand. A presence that inspired both fear and awe, reshaping the plantation forever. The rituals, ceremonies, and strange acts that began on the plantation marked a turning point in the unfolding darkness of 1838. What initially seemed like curiosity or fascination on the master's part slowly transformed into a series of deliberate actions that disturbed everyone who lived there. At first, these acts were subtle. The master would stay up late at night, lighting candles in corners of the house where no work or prayer should take place, murmuring words under his breath that no one could understand. He often carried small objects, pieces of cloth, coins or herbs, into the enslaved man's quarters, leaving them in patterns that seemed meaningless, but were executed with obsessive care. The other slaves whispered among themselves, uneasy at these unusual behaviors. They could feel a tension in the air, a sense that something unseen had taken hold of the plantation. Over time, the rituals grew more elaborate. The master began to perform them openly, though still in secrecy from outsiders. He would arrange furniture and objects in precise geometric patterns on the floor, sometimes marking the arrangements with chalk or salt. He seemed to believe that these symbols and formations held some kind of power, a connection to the enslaved man whom he had begun to worship. On certain nights, he would insist that the man stand in the center of the room while he carried out his ceremonies, speaking incantations in a low, urgent voice that made the air feel heavy and charged. The man himself remained calm, almost indifferent, as if he understood the full weight of the master's actions, but chose not to interfere. The other enslaved individuals watched with fear and uncertainty. They had never encountered such behavior from a plantation master before, and the air of the house became suffocating. Some reported feeling chills, or hearing whispered voices when no one else was present. At times, objects would shift or fall during these rituals, though there was no one there to move them. The sense that something unnatural was taking place became undeniable. Those who tried to avoid the master during these ceremonies were often met with intense scrutiny or subtle threats, leaving them trapped in a tense, almost oppressive environment. Neighbors who passed by the plantation noticed strange lights flickering in the windows late at night. Some described seeing shapes moving inside, but when approached, the house appeared quiet and empty. The master's obsession seemed to extend beyond his own walls. He would travel to secluded parts of the property, the overgrown gardens, abandoned barns, and forested edges of the land, carrying the enslaved man with him, insisting that he participate in the ceremonies in silence. These excursions were marked by strange sounds, murmurs, faint chanting, or the low hum of energy that seemed to rise from the ground itself. People nearby began to speculate that something unnatural had taken hold, and fear began to spread beyond the plantation. The ceremonies also began to affect the master physically and mentally. He would spend hours in isolation, sometimes appearing drained and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking as he focused on the rituals. The more he performed them, the more intense his obsession became, and it was clear that he relied on the presence of the enslaved man to carry them out correctly. There was a sense that the master believed the man possessed a power that he could channel or harness, and the rituals were his attempt to access it. This created a strange, almost symbiotic relationship, the master feeding off the man's presence, the man maintaining an aura of control simply by existing in his proximity. At night, the plantation was filled with an eerie quiet. The other enslaved people dared not move about, fearing the consequences of interrupting these rituals. Animals became uneasy, sensing the unnatural energy in the air. Dogs would whine or refuse to enter certain rooms, and livestock would behave unpredictably. Even the natural world seemed affected, as if the balance of the plantation had been altered by the master's growing devotion. Every ceremony reinforced the master's obsession, drawing him further from reason and deeper into a world no one else could fully understand. Some visitors, drawn by curiosity or suspicion, attempted to investigate. They described feeling a weight in the air, a sense that the house itself was alive with unseen energy. Candles would extinguish on their own, doors would creak open and closed without explanation, and whispers seemed to echo from walls that had no one inside them. Those who witnessed these occurrences often left shaken, believing that the master's rituals had opened a door to something beyond human comprehension. Something dangerous, dark, and yet intimately tied to the enslaved man. Ultimately, these rituals became the defining feature of life on the plantation. They transformed the house into a place of mystery and dread, where fear and reverence coexisted. The master's obsession with the enslaved man, manifested through these ceremonies, reshaped the daily rhythms of the plantation and left a permanent mark on those who lived through it. The combination of worship, ritual, and silent intimidation created an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore, a darkness that would linger long after the candles burned out and the master's obsession faded. In this way, the rituals and ceremonies weren't just symbolic acts. They were the manifestation of a psychological and spiritual shift that overtook the plantation. They signaled the point at which fascination became worship, and worship became a force capable of reshaping the lives and minds of everyone within its orbit. The enslaved man, intentionally or not, had become the fulcrum of this power, and the plantation itself became a stage for a story that would be whispered for generations, a tale of obsession, ritual, and the terrifying consequences of one man's devotion to another who could never be fully understood. The reactions and fear among the other slaves and household members grew quickly as the master's obsession became impossible to ignore. At first, many tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that it was just a passing fancy or an eccentricity of the master's personality. But as the rituals and behaviors became more frequent, more elaborate, and more intense, it became clear that something far deeper and far darker was unfolding. The air of the plantation itself seemed to shift. There was a palpable tension that could be felt in every corner of the house and across the fields. The other enslaved individuals began to whisper among themselves, sharing stories of what they had witnessed, and a growing fear took hold that their lives could be affected simply by proximity to the man at the center of it all. Many noticed that the master had begun to act inconsistently toward the rest of the household. Tasks that were once simple and straightforward were now met with scrutiny and suspicion, particularly if they interfered with his attention toward the enslaved man. Simple mistakes or delays were met with anger, but the anger often seemed to have no rational cause. It was as though the master's emotions were entirely controlled by the presence or absence of the man he worshipped. The slaves, already living under constant threat and uncertainty, felt that their position had become even more precarious. A glance from the master during these obsessive episodes could carry an unspoken warning, and even small actions were carefully calculated to avoid triggering his ire. The fear was compounded by the unexplainable events that accompanied the master's obsession. Candles would flicker and extinguish unexpectedly during his rituals. Doors would slam or creak open on their own, and strange whispers seemed to echo from rooms where no one else was present. Many of the slaves believed that supernatural forces had been unleashed, and that the master's attention on this one man had opened a door to something beyond human understanding. Nights became especially tense, as the household waited for the master's ritualistic behaviors to begin, knowing that any disruption could bring about unpredictable consequences. Even the most skeptical of the household staff began to alter their behavior out of fear. They avoided walking near the master and the enslaved man when ceremonies were taking place, and many would not speak unless spoken to. The man at the center of it all remained calm, his presence seemingly amplifying the tension in the household without overtly doing anything. This silence, this quiet power, made him almost untouchable in the eyes of both the master and the other slaves. The psychological effect of the master's obsession, combined with the man's calm composure, created an environment of fear that was both constant and suffocating. Over time, this fear began to affect the daily routines of the plantation. Workers hesitated to move about freely, livestock became skittish, and even the natural rhythms of the land seemed disrupted. The plantation was no longer a place of work and survival. It had become a stage for a dark power struggle, one that the other slaves could neither influence nor escape. They lived in a state of heightened awareness, constantly measuring their actions to avoid drawing the master's obsessive focus or, worse, triggering the rituals that accompanied it. Whispers of danger spread beyond the plantation as well. Neighbors and travelers reported seeing strange lights, hearing unusual sounds at night, and observing behavior that defied explanation. Rumors circulated that the master was engaging in acts of worship toward the enslaved man, that he was attempting to harness some form of unseen power, and that anyone who interfered might face dire consequences. These stories further reinforced the sense of dread among the household staff, as they realized that the fear was not confined to their own experiences, but was shared by the broader community. Even among the slaves themselves, there were mixed reactions. Some were terrified, feeling powerless in the face of forces they could neither see nor understand. Others began to speculate about the man's nature. Was he truly human, or something more? Was the master's devotion harmless, or did it carry a malevolent force that could affect everyone on the plantation? These questions went unanswered, heightening the sense of mystery and fear that hung over the property like a heavy fog. In essence, the reactions of the household members transformed the plantation into a place of constant anxiety. Fear was no longer just a response to the master's temper or the harsh realities of enslavement. It was now tied to something unseen, something that existed in the space between obsession and worship. Every glance, every whisper, every ritual became a signal to tread carefully, to move cautiously, and to recognize that the balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be measured or controlled. Ultimately, the fear and unease among the household and enslaved workers underscored the full psychological weight of the master's obsession. It wasn't simply a personal fascination. It had ripple effects that touched every life on the plantation. The rituals, the obsession, and the enigmatic presence of the enslaved man combined to create an atmosphere that was both oppressive and terrifying, leaving a lasting mark on those who witnessed it, a dark shadow that would linger long after the events themselves had passed into legend. The consequences of the master's worship and obsession quickly became impossible to ignore, and their effects rippled across the plantation in ways that no one could have anticipated. What began as private fascination escalated into behaviors and decisions that altered the very structure of daily life for everyone who lived there. The master's fixation on the enslaved man consumed him to the point where his attention to ordinary matters, harvesting crops, managing livestock, overseeing workers, was neglected. Tasks that had once been completed efficiently now suffered delays or were carried out haphazardly, because his mind was always occupied with thoughts of the man he worshipped. Orders became inconsistent, and instructions that once held the weight of authority were now subject to his obsession, creating confusion and fear among the workers who depended on the routine to survive. As the master's behavior grew more erratic, it was clear that his obsession was no longer harmless. He began to favor the enslaved man above all others, giving him privileges and access that disrupted the plantation's hierarchy. Meals were prepared specifically to suit the man's tastes. Work assignments were adjusted to ensure he remained central to daily operations. The master even went so far as to interrupt punishment or discipline for others if he believed it would displease or upset the man he worshipped. For the other enslaved individuals, this created a tense atmosphere. On one hand, the man's position seemed almost untouchable, yet on the other, the unpredictability of the master's actions left everyone walking on eggshells. Fear of reprisal was ever present. The master's moods became linked directly to the man's presence or approval. If the man was absent, the master grew anxious, pacing the halls, muttering to himself, or lashing out at those around him for minor infractions. When the man was present, the master was often distracted, focusing solely on him, but still enforcing his authority unpredictably. The enslaved population quickly learned that survival meant observing the master and the man carefully, anticipating changes in routine, and avoiding actions that could inadvertently trigger the master's obsessive behavior. In essence, the man's existence and the master's worship of him created a living, breathing system of tension that enveloped the entire plantation. The consequences also extended beyond daily life into the spiritual and psychological realm. The rituals the master performed, combined with his obsession, created an atmosphere of unease and superstition. Stories of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, sudden temperature changes, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere spread throughout the household. Slaves whispered about curses and omens, unsure whether these events were real or the manifestations of collective fear. Visitors and neighbors who witnessed unusual behavior reported it to others, and word of the master's obsession spread through the surrounding community. Fear and suspicion began to isolate the plantation, creating an aura of danger and mystery that extended beyond its physical boundaries. Health and well-being on the plantation began to deteriorate as a result of this disruption. Work schedules were inconsistent, meals were sometimes neglected, and the constant tension weighed heavily on both the master and the enslaved workers. Those who had once trusted the predictability of the plantation hierarchy found themselves unable to anticipate the master's next move. Families worried about the safety of children, elders were unnerved by the change in daily routines, and the collective anxiety contributed to a sense that the plantation was no longer governed by reason, but by the master's capricious worship of a single individual. The man at the center of the obsession, meanwhile, remained calm, almost eerily indifferent. Whether intentionally or not, his presence amplified the master's behavior, giving the obsession a tangible effect on the plantation. By simply existing in the house, he became the focal point for all the disruptions, rituals, and unpredictable behavior that the master exhibited. The power dynamic shifted so dramatically that the master, while still holding legal authority, appeared increasingly powerless to resist his own compulsions. It was a complete inversion, a master enthralled by one he had enslaved, with the entire household caught in the ripple effects. Ultimately, the long-term consequences of this obsession were profound. The plantation itself became a place marked by fear, superstition, and tension. Even after the master's death or the man's departure, the stories persisted, haunting the community and embedding themselves into local folklore. The imbalance created by worship and obsession had left psychological scars on those who survived it, shaping their perceptions of power, control, and the inexplicable influence one individual could have over another. In the end, the consequences were both immediate and enduring. The master's worship destabilized the social and operational structure of the plantation, instilled fear in all who lived there, and transformed a place of labor and survival into a setting dominated by obsession, ritual, and superstition. It demonstrated how a single obsession, unchecked and amplified by power, could ripple outward to affect every life around it, leaving a legacy of fear and mystery that would endure long after the events themselves had passed into legend. The long-lasting legacy and whispered legends of the plantation's darkest secret stretched far beyond the walls of the house and the boundaries of the land itself. Even decades after the events of 1838, stories of the master's obsession and the enigmatic enslaved man persisted, passed down through generations like a cautionary tale of power, desire, and fear. The plantation itself became a symbol, not merely of wealth or labor, but of something darker, an almost supernatural disturbance that had been seeded by the master's unexplainable devotion. Those who survived the events never spoke of them openly, yet the memory lingered in hushed conversations, warning travelers and distant relatives that the land was marked by an event that defied understanding. As word spread, locals began to treat the plantation as a place to avoid. Tales circulated of lights flickering in the windows late at night, of the faint sound of chanting or murmured words drifting on the wind, and of fleeting figures glimpsed near the edges of the overgrown grounds. Children were warned never to wander near the property after sunset. Elders spoke in quiet tones of the man who worshipped the slave, and even neighboring plantation owners refrained from inquiring too closely into what had occurred there. The story evolved, taking on an almost mythic quality, with each retelling emphasizing the fear, mystery, and unnatural elements of the master's obsession. The enslaved man himself became a figure of legend. Whether he had been aware of the extent of the master's devotion or had used it to his advantage, his calm and unflappable demeanor was remembered as something extraordinary, even unsettling. People spoke of him as if he had a power that transcended his position as a slave, a presence that could command influence without words. Some stories hinted at supernatural abilities, an almost magical control over the master, the ability to manipulate events through mere presence, or even a mysterious protection that prevented harm from befalling him despite the chaos around him. His legacy became a mix of awe and fear, cementing him as an enduring figure in local lore. The plantation itself, long after its operational life ended, retained a reputation steeped in unease. Even when the buildings crumbled and nature reclaimed the land, travelers reported sensations of being watched, sudden chills, and inexplicable noises. Hunters, wanderers, and historians who ventured near would speak of shadows that moved without a source, footsteps echoing through empty rooms, and the uncanny feeling that the past had never truly left the soil. The land was considered cursed by some, haunted by the consequences of obsession and worship, and imbued with a lingering energy that could not be rationally explained. Over time, the story of the master and the enslaved man became intertwined with the cultural memory of the region. It was cited as a warning of what could happen when power was misused, when obsession overcame reason, and when one person's fixation disrupted the lives of all around them. The tale entered local folklore, recorded in journals, whispered in oral histories, and eventually appearing in newspaper accounts and regional narratives as a story too strange to ignore. While facts were obscured by time, exaggeration, and rumor, the essence of the story, a master's unexplainable worship and its destabilizing effects, remained a potent symbol. Even modern visitors to the area report a sense of unease when approaching the old plantation grounds. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, there is a lingering recognition that history has left an imprint here, one that is difficult to quantify or dismiss. Scholars and paranormal enthusiasts alike have noted that the plantation's reputation endures not merely because of the events themselves, but because of the psychological weight of obsession, the inversion of social hierarchy, and the power dynamics that played out in ways that defied contemporary understanding. It is a story that continues to captivate, terrify, and fascinate. Ultimately, the legacy of this plantation is twofold. On one level, it serves as a chilling historical example of obsession's destructive potential, illustrating how one individual's fixation can disrupt lives, instill fear, and create enduring trauma. On another level, it has become a story that transcends its historical context, blending fact and legend into a narrative that explores the boundaries between human behavior, power, and the unexplained. The master's worship, the rituals, the fear, and the calm, commanding presence of the enslaved man combine to create a tale that remains etched in memory, a shadow of the past that refuses to fade. Even now, the plantation is remembered not only as a place of labor and hierarchy, but as a site of psychological intrigue and enduring mystery. The story reminds us that history is not always confined to dates and documents. It lives in the whispers, the legends, and the unease that lingers in spaces long after the people themselves are gone. The plantation's darkest secret, rooted in obsession and worship, continues to inspire stories, speculation, and cautionary lessons, ensuring that it will never be forgotten.